June 1944. The Third Reich has been at war for 5 years. In the east, the Red Army advances relentlessly after Kursk. In the Mediterranean, the Allies have driven the Germans out of North Africa and landed in Italy. And in the English Channel, the greatest invasion force the world has ever known prepares to cross. One central reason why the Normandy landings were not an easy task was precisely this. The German soldiers stationed in the 15 key resistance strongpoints along the Norman coast. Armed with MG-42 machine guns renowned for their rate of fire of up to 1,500 rounds per minute, those defenders held their positions and opened fire without pause on the soldiers trying to fight their way across the sand. What the Allies had planned as a coordinated operation with the fewest possible casualties ended up in several sectors, turning into a bloodbath that stained the water and the shoreline red. Entire squads and platoons were cut down within seconds of being exposed as they came off the ramps. Soldiers trapped by waves rising to their chests struggled to reach cover under the weight of 30 kilograms of equipment while the crossfire of machine guns swept the beach from end to end. Many did not manage to take even 10 steps. The fortress that no one ever finished 200 million tons of reinforced concrete, a wall that, in propaganda newsreels, was presented as an impregnable barrier stretching 2,700 kilometers from the Spanish border to the Arctic of northern Norway. That was how the Atlantic Wall appeared on German cinema screens and in the communiques of Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda. On the ground, it was something entirely different. The order to build it was issued on March 23, 1942, through Directive No. 40, in which Hitler demanded the creation of a continuous defensive line along the entire Atlantic coast. The scale of the project was pharaonic on paper: 15,000 fortified artillery positions manned by 300,000 troops, connected by a network of bunkers, casemates, underground tunnels, coastal batteries and minefields that were supposed to turn every beach into a grave for any invading force. The TOT organization, the Reich's civil and military engineering arm, was set in motion immediately. In UFA newsreels, the images showed endless columns of trucks, cranes lifting blocks of concrete, and martial-looking soldiers guarding empty horizons. What they did not show was what the engineers on the ground already knew: that the available concrete was insufficient for what Hitler had promised, that forced labor produced poor quality work, and that strategic ports consumed most of the resources, leaving the beaches in a state of permanent deficit. When Field Marshal Erwin Rommel took command of Army Group B in November 1943 and began his inspections, what he found left him dismayed. In his diary, he wrote that the positions were a random mixture of solid bunkers and half-dug trenches, with garrisons made up of men who had gone months without sufficient ammunition to conduct live-fire training. Cherbourg, Boulogne and Le Havre had casemates several meters thick, with heavy artillery well protected. But the beach sectors between them, the stretches of sand that no one considered likely sites for a major landing because they were not close to any port, were no man's land. A few roofless machine gun nests, scattered obstacles in the water, and static battalions whose real mission was to die where they stood. The most absurd contradiction of the project lay in the distribution of concrete. Hitler had ordered that the submarine pens at Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire and La Rochelle have walls up to 7 meters thick, sufficient to absorb the heaviest bombs available. He justified this as a strategic investment. A new generation of U-boats, the so-called Type 21, was going to change the naval balance of the Atlantic and had to be protected. Meanwhile, the coastal defenses of Normandy received only leftover materials. In January 1944, when Rommel accelerated construction under his direct supervision, Anthony Beevor notes in his reference work D-Day, The Battle for Normandy, that in some sectors construction was barely 18% of what had been planned. The engineers responsible knew it, they filed the reports, and they remained silent. The TOT organization relied largely on forced labor, Soviet prisoners of war, requisitioned French workers and laborers brought in from occupied countries. Quality varied enormously. In some sectors, the bunker walls could absorb medium-caliber naval shells. In others, the concrete was so porous that engineering officers refused to stamp it with their seal of approval. The very men who were supposed to fight from those positions knew this. Several of them wrote about it in letters that their families preserved for decades. Rommel did not waste time lamenting. From January 1944 onward, he toured the coast almost without rest, rising at 5 in the morning, having breakfast with Lieutenant General Hans Speidel, his chief of staff, and setting off in his official car for hours of inspections. The results of that effort were concrete and measurable. In January 1944, there were 1.7 million mines along the western French coast. By June, the number exceeded 6.5 million. Millions of obstacles were installed on the beaches, steel sea elements, welded iron tripods topped with waterproofed tellermine mines and 6-meter-high wooden posts in glider landing fields, nicknamed with irony by German soldiers as Rommel's asparagus. In positions lacking modern artillery, engineers dismantled turrets from French tanks captured in 1940 and embedded them in concrete blocks, creating fixed firing points that their own men dubbed Tobruk's, in reference to the battles of North Africa. It was ingenuity born of scarcity, not abundance. But the deepest problem of the defense was not concrete or mines, it was the fragmentation of command. The Kriegsmarine controlled the coastal artillery and answered to Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, not to Rommel. The Luftwaffe had around 350,000 personnel in the West, most of them assigned to logistical tasks within Göring's power apparatus, and the Reichsmarschall categorically refused to place his anti-aircraft artillery under the control of the army. Every time Rommel demanded coordination between ground defense and air protection, someone invoked a different chain of command and the matter was left unresolved. When Rommel expressed his frustration with the Luftwaffe's uselessness, Hitler's headquarters placated him with promises of mass production of Me-262 jet fighters and secret weapons that supposedly would force Great Britain to surrender. Rommel had seen what Allied air superiority did in North Africa and did not believe a single one of those promises. The debate over the placement of the armoured divisions was the most serious strategic error before the invasion. Rommel argued, correctly, as events would prove, that Allied air superiority would make it impossible to move armoured forces in mass once the invasion began. The only chance of victory was to destroy the Allies on the beaches in the first hours before they could consolidate a beachhead and begin unloading heavy equipment. "The first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive," he wrote in a January 1944 memorandum. "For the Allies, as well as for Germany, it will be the longest day." He therefore demanded that the Panzer units be positioned close to the coast, ready to counterattack in minutes, not hours. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and General Leo Geyer von Schweppenberg disagreed radically. Drawing on their experience on the Russian front, they believed the Allies should be allowed to land, the main axis of attack identified, and only then should a massive counterattack be launched with all armoured formations concentrated. Keeping the armour close to the coast meant exposing it to Allied naval gunfire before it could even fight. The solution advocated by von Schweppenberg was to keep the Panzer units north of Paris, out of range of naval guns but positioned to move rapidly to any point along the coast. It was sound military doctrine on paper. It was also the doctrine that had worked in 1941 and 1942. The problem was that in 1944 the German air superiority that would have made such mass movement possible no longer existed. Hitler did not resolve the debate, he drained it of substance. His decision was a compromise that in practice satisfied neither approach. He gave Rommel operational control over 3 Panzer divisions, the 2nd, the 21st and the 116th, but placed the first 2 north of the Seine, far from Normandy. The other 4 divisions that constituted the true core of striking power, the 1st SS Leibstandarte, the 12th SS Hitler Youth, the 17th SS and the Panzer Lehr, remained under the direct control of the OKW and could not move without the Führer's personal authorization. It was a system designed so that a single man would make all the decisions at the most critical moment of the war. That man was going to be asleep when the moment arrived. The men who waited. The lives of German soldiers in Normandy during the spring of 1944 had a paradoxical texture. The crushing routine of garrison life mixed with an anxiety that grew week by week like grass pushing through concrete. For the men who came from the Eastern Front, France was an almost incomprehensible privilege. In North Africa, temperatures had reached 50 degrees. In Russia, they fell to 30 below zero with biting wind. Soviet winters killed men by freezing even before the enemy appeared. In the Norman villages of the spring of 1944, markets offered fresh cheese, calvados, cider, and apples. The farmers, resigned to 4 years of occupation, treated the soldiers with a weary cordiality that seemed almost civilized compared to the open hostility of Ukrainian villages or the terror of total war that was devouring the East. Not a few of those men would acknowledge years later that Normandy had seemed to them an almost enviable posting. That perception made them less vigilant than they should have been. The composition of German forces in the Norman sector in the spring of 1944 was radically heterogeneous, and that heterogeneity was a weakness discussed by commanders only in private. Veteran field divisions, units with experience accumulated across multiple fronts, with non-commissioned officers who had been in combat for years and their own mobile artillery, were the minority. Most of the 36 infantry divisions deployed in France were static units, designed to defend fixed positions and lacking the ability to respond to a mobile attack. They contained many veterans with wounds that disqualified them from the Eastern Front, men with lungs damaged by gas, with amputated limbs fitted with prostheses, with spinal injuries that made them incapable of marching more than 10 kilometers. And alongside them were recruits aged 16 and 17 with no experience whatsoever. The army referred to these formations with bureaucratic coldness as stomach and ear battalions. Men with ulcers, chronic digestive problems, or partial deafness were grouped into separate units because their physical conditions made them unfit to serve alongside healthy troops. Some of these battalions were made up almost entirely of patients on special diets or men with hearing aids dependent on batteries that arrived irregularly. There was also a factor of fragility that German officers discussed only in the most restricted circles, the uncertain loyalty of a significant portion of the men under their command. The German army in France in 1944 was not composed exclusively of Germans. It included Volksdeutsche, men of Germanic descent born in Poland, Romania, Yugoslavia, the Baltic states, and the Soviet Union, along with forcibly conscripted recruits from Alsace, Lorraine, and Luxembourg, territories annexed to the Reich in 1940 and 1942. Many of these men barely mastered the German language. Several claimed to understand it, but responded in French or Polish when stress made the cognitive effort of operating in a language that was not their own too difficult. In units with a high proportion of personnel of non-German origin, non-commissioned officers watched especially closely for any sign of disaffection. This was not paranoia. Before the landing, several soldiers of Polish and Czech origin integrated into Wehrmacht units had deserted to join the French resistance. The commanders knew this, recorded it in their internal reports, and filed it away. There was also the group the Germans called Ostlegionen or Osttruppen, units formed from former Soviet prisoners of war who had chosen to don the German uniform, either out of anti-communist conviction or simply to escape the prisoner of war camps, where mortality was devastating. These battalions, Armenian, Georgian, Azerbaijani, Kazakh, Ukrainian, were equipped with captured weapons from various sources and had a combat value that their own German commanders described as marginal. In the 84th Corps of 84th Army Corps, which defended the Normandy sector, these eastern battalions represented approximately 1/6 of the total manpower. They were men who, in many cases, did not understand why they were fighting in a foreign country under a flag that was not their own, against an enemy who, in some cases, might offer them freedom as a condition of surrender. The strongest and best prepared unit in the entire Norman sector was the 352nd Infantry Division, and the fact that Allied intelligence failed to detect it was one of the costliest errors made by the planners of Operation Overlord. The division had been created in November 1943 in Saint-Lô under the command of Lieutenant General Dietrich Krase, a veteran officer of the Soviet front with experience in defensive combat. Its corps consisted of veterans of the Russian campaign, men who knew what it meant to hold a position under massive artillery fire, supplemented by young recruits who had received several months of intensive training before their deployment. Rommel transferred the division to the Bayeux sector in March 1944 and integrated it into the defensive system of the central Norman coast, reinforcing existing resistance nests with its mobile artillery and reconnaissance battalions. When Allied planners drew up their casualty estimates for the landing at Omaha Beach, they calculated that they would face 2 battalions of the 716th Static Division. Older men, physically worn down, with low morale and deficient armament. They did not know that the 352nd was there. That intelligence error would cost thousands of lives. In the individual resistance nests that the German manual called Widerstands Nester, soldiers followed a routine that erased the weaks. 6-hour guard shifts inside bunkers with concrete oozing dampness and the smell of salt and gun oil impregnating clothes and hair. The sound of the sea, which some described in their letters as a constant and slightly maddening presence. Periods of rest in requisitioned farmhouses where straw on the floor competed with operational maps for the limited space available. The exchange of cigarettes and calvados for information and silence with local farmers. Some soldiers, especially the younger ones, recalled years later that those months in Normandy had the strange quality of dreams, too calm to be real, with the constant sensation that something was about to break. What none of them could see from their positions was the industrial scale of what was being prepared on the other side of the Channel. In southern England, more than 1.5 million soldiers waited to embark at bases spread from Cornwall to Kent. American shipyards had produced more than 4,000 landing craft of various types over the previous 2 years. Ammunition depots were so full that logistics engineers had begun building additional underground storage facilities. The Allied aviation industry was delivering new fighter bombers in quantities that no projection model of the German General Staff had incorporated. And above all this hovered a secret the Germans had failed to decipher. The Allies had built 2 artificial floating harbours, the so-called mulberries, modular structures designed to be towed to Normandy and assembled on the beaches, solving the logistical problem of a landing without a natural port. The entire argument of the German General Staff about the necessity of defending natural harbours rested on the assumption that the Allies would need one to supply their invasion. The Allies were going to bring their own with them. The moment when everything began, the early hours of June 6, 1944, arrived over Normandy with a surface calm that concealed beneath it the greatest movement the English Channel had ever known. From 11 p.m. on June 5th, a chain of circumstances had favoured the Allies in an almost systematic way. The Luftwaffe had destroyed most of the French coastal radar stations in the preceding weeks, though in reality it had been the Allies themselves who strategically destroyed them, eliminating twice as many stations in sectors that were not Normandy in order not to reveal the true objective. With no operational radar, the German observers at the coastal posts stared into the darkness of the Channel without any technical system capable of detecting what was approaching. Only their ears, only their eyes. And the English Channel on the night of June 5th to 6th, 1944, was covered by low clouds that reduced visibility to zero. General Erwin Rommel had made his decision to be absent based on a weather forecast. The Zentralwetterdienst, the German Central Meteorological Service, had predicted a week of storms over the Channel, with force 7 winds and waves of up to 2 meters. Under those conditions, any amphibious landing would be impossible. Landing craft would capsize, troops would reach shore in a state of total incapacity, and gliders would be unable to operate. Rommel considered that he had time to travel to Herlingen, celebrate his wife Lucy's birthday on June 6th, and visit Hitler in Berchtesgaden the following day to request operational control over the 12th SS and the Panzer Lehr Division. The Allied meteorologist, Group Captain James Stagg of the RAF, had detected a brief window of improved weather lasting barely 36 hours between 2 storm systems. The Germans did not see it. That difference in a weather forecast changed the course of history. The first to notice something abnormal was neither an intelligence officer nor a radar operator. It was Lieutenant General Josef Reichert, commander of the 711th Infantry Division in the sector east of the Orne estuary. Reichert had been talking in the officers' mess until after midnight, a habit that irritated his superiors but which he justified as part of maintaining unit morale. When he was finally heading to bed, he heard a sound that did not fit the night. Aircraft engines, many of them flying low among the clouds. He went outside to see what was happening. There was a full moon visible through breaks in the clouds, and in one of those gaps he could make out several aircraft circling over the building of his command post. He ran inside to grab his pistol, and then he heard the shout, "Paratroopers!" The quadruple 20mm anti-aircraft guns opened fire. The operations officer transmitted the alarm to the 84th Corps, while Reichert tried to contact headquarters in Rouen. Telephone lines had already been cut at several points. Along the front, the first minutes of the early morning were a succession of contradictory and confusing reports. The paratroopers of the US 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, together with those of the British 6th Airborne Division, had been dropped over an operational area of more than 80 square kilometers. The dispersion caused by the clouds and poor navigation over unfamiliar terrain was so great that the Germans who saw them land received reports of paratroopers in locations that in many cases were 20 kilometers apart from one another. It was impossible to reconstruct a coherent picture of the situation from headquarters. Patrols sent out to investigate often found nothing. Messengers sent to restore communications disappeared on roads filled with enemy soldiers whom they themselves could not place on a map. The commander of the 84th Corps, General Erich Marx, received reports placing American paratroopers south of Carentan and ordered the only reserve battalion available, the Kampfgruppe of Colonel Ernst Meyer, to move toward that area. At 3 a.m., Meyer and his grenadiers were on the road in the Norman darkness, advancing toward an objective that would turn out hours later never to have existed at the indicated coordinates. In the WN-62 resistance nest on the cliffs above Omaha Beach, Lieutenant Bernhard Frerking was awakened by the sound of engines. He climbed to the observation position and looked out over the channel. He saw nothing, only fog and darkness. His orderly, Private Heinrich Severloh accompanied him. Years later, Severloh would state that he was among the first to glimpse some of the ships when the clouds momentarily parted. 5, perhaps 7 vessels advancing in parallel toward the coast, laying a smoke screen. The sight lasted less than a minute before the clouds closed again. Frerking picked up his binoculars and said, "Well then, here they are." He called the radio operator and ordered him to try to contact the vessels. There was no response. Frerking sent the report up the chain of command and returned to his bunker to wait for instructions that took hours to arrive. At 4 a.m., Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, already fully awake at his headquarters in Saint-Germain-en-Laye on the outskirts of Paris, called the OKW at the Berghof to request the immediate deployment of the armored reserve divisions, specifically the 21st Panzer Division and the Panzer Lehr Division. Hitler was asleep. He had stayed awake until 2 in the morning during one of his usual evening gatherings, in this case with Eva Braun and Joseph Goebbels, discussing cinema and the world situation. The duty officers at the OKW evaluated the available reports, scattered paratroopers, confused reports of naval activity, unclear radio transmissions, and concluded that they did not have sufficient information to justify waking the Führer. According to protocol, no OKW officer had the authority to order the movement of the reserve divisions. Only Hitler did, and Hitler was asleep. Von Rundstedt's request was denied. The Panzer units remained immobile. The young Corporal Franz Gockel, 18 years old at WN-62, recalled that when the highest alert reached their position, no one initially took it seriously. They had experienced so many alerts in the preceding weeks that the psychological mechanism of desensitization had done its work. Most of the men in their bunks tried to keep sleeping. Sergeant Ludwig Förster had to insist, "This time it's real. They're already coming." Only then did the fatigue disappear, and within a few minutes the men of WN-62 were at their posts, checking the mechanisms of the machine guns in the darkness, wiping the salty dew from the metal parts with rags, waiting to see something on a sea that remained black and invisible. In the western sector of the front, command problems were aggravated by the absence of several crucial generals. General Friedrich Dollmann, commander of the 7th Army, had scheduled war exercises in Rennes for the morning of June 6th, a simulation of a response to an Allied landing with an unsettling sense of the irony of fate, which meant that several of his divisional commanders were traveling toward that city when the alarms began to go off. General Wilhelm Falle of the 91st Air Landing Infantry Division heard the roar of Allied aircraft while driving toward Rennes and turned around. He never reached his command post. Paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne Division ambushed him on the road, throwing Falle out of his vehicle with severe injuries. When he tried to reach for his pistol, an American lieutenant shot and killed him. Falle was the first German general to die in Normandy. General Edgar Feuchtinger, commander of the 21st Panzer Division, the only armored unit in position to attack the beaches in the early hours, was that night in Paris with his mistress. He carried no radio with him. When he finally returned to his command post, his division had been paralyzed for hours, waiting for orders that only he was able to give. Feutinger was an artilleryman with no real experience in armored warfare. According to historian Anthony Beaver, he had obtained command of the division thanks to his connections within the Nazi Party rather than his military competence. His absence on the most critical night of the campaign was a disaster from which the division took hours to recover. During those hours, the Allies landed without a single German armored vehicle moving toward the coast. The Steel Deluge, the beaches at 5:50 a.m. on June 6, 1944, the horizon of the English Channel became fire. From the battleships USS Texas, USS Arkansas, HMS Warspite, HMS Ramillies, and the monitor HMS Roberts, along with 20 cruisers and 65 destroyers positioned off the 5 landing sectors, hundreds of guns turned toward the land and opened fire simultaneously. Warspite's 380mm shells weighed more than 870 kilograms. When they struck, they raised columns of earth, concrete, and steel 20 meters high. More than 38,000 rockets were launched over the coastal strip in the first few minutes. The noise was not an articulated sound, it was a pressure that passed through bodies, compressed the lungs, and made clear thinking impossible. Inside the bunkers, dust fell from the walls with every nearby explosion. Instruments vibrated on their mounts and men pressed against the concrete with clenched teeth, waiting for it to stop. Inside the resistance nests, the defenders had received a precise instruction: remain under cover during the bombardment and do not open fire until enemy soldiers were 400 meters from the shore. It was a tactically sensible order. Exposing oneself during naval bombardment was suicide, and opening fire too early alerted the destroyer's artillery, which could adjust their aim with devastating precision. The fire discipline that the defenders of Omaha maintained during the first minutes of the landing was one of the factors that turned that beach into a slaughter. When the ramps of the landing craft fell, the Germans opened fire from intact positions with perfect lines of fire at distances that made missing impossible. The preliminary bombardment had been, in several sectors, far less effective than Allied planners had expected. At Omaha Beach, the B-17 bombers of the 8th Air Force, which were supposed to destroy the bunkers before 6:30 a.m., dropped their load with a delay of between 30 seconds and 3 minutes, fearing hitting their own troops. In a beach sector where the speed of the low clouds made direct visual observation impossible, this delay meant that most of the 13,000 bombs fell up to 3 kilometers inland on empty fields. No bunkers were destroyed. The machine guns, anti-tank guns, mortars and firing nests of the 352nd Division remained completely intact. Soldiers descending the ramps of the landing craft faced a defensive system that the bombardment had not touched. Utah Beach. At the western end, the landing of the U.S. 4th Infantry Division benefited from a chain of mistakes that accidentally worked in its favor. A navigation error, attributed to stronger currents than calculated, diverted the first wave about 1,800 meters south of the intended point. This sector was precisely one of the areas that had received the most effective aerial bombardment along the entire Normandy coast. Pilots of the 9th Bomber Command had descended to lower altitudes than specified, achieving unusual accuracy. German defenses along that stretch were damaged. The only nearby strong point was Nest Number 5, and the garrison, elements of the 709th Static Division, had lost much of its firepower before the first American soldier arrived. Captain Arthur Janker, in command of Nest Number 5, watched helplessly as 2 of his ammunition bunkers burned before the landing began. His anti-tank gun had been destroyed in the bombardment, and one of his own soldiers shouted to surrender. Janker, who had earned the Knight's Cross on the Eastern Front, did not panic. He ordered positions to be held and took his rifle. When the U.S. 8th Infantry Regiment landed, it was met with fire from Janker's survivors. But the resistance was already tactically irrelevant, with no communications, no artillery, and several of his men, including a Pole and a Czech, surrendering one by one in despair. Janker fired his 2 agreed-upon signal flares to call for supporting artillery. No one responded. His messenger, sent by bicycle to the support batteries when communications were cut, lay dead in a trench less than a kilometer away, shot by an Allied paratrooper. When a Sherman fired on his position and Janke regained consciousness on the ground, an American soldier was dragging him toward a bunker saying, "Take it easy, German." It was 8:30 a.m. Janke was a prisoner. The Battle of Utah Beach was over for him in 120 minutes. Omaha Beach. Here, the war took on a dimension different from any other beach that day. The combination of terrain, cliffs up to 50 meters high that dominated 8 kilometers of open sand without natural cover, the presence of the 352nd Infantry Division, which Allied intelligence had not detected, and the failure of the preliminary bombardment created the conditions for a slaughter that nearly halted the entire landing. The 7,000 German defenders of the 352nd, reinforced by elements of the 716th Static Division, were distributed across 15 resistance nests staggered from the sand to the top of the cliffs, with intersecting lines of fire covering every meter of the beach. WN-62, WN-65, WN-68 and WN-70 were the central nests of the Easy Red sector, the most densely defended. Each contained MG-42 machine guns capable of firing up to 1,500 rounds per minute, 80mm mortars, anti-tank guns and observation positions with direct lines of sight to the shore. The bunkers had been built with their embrasures angled obliquely to the coast, not facing the sea, which made them invisible to direct naval fire and allowed them to sweep the beach along with lethal enfilade. When the ramps of the first LCVP landing craft fell at 6:30 a.m. off Omaha, the defenders opened fire exactly as instructed. Machine guns aimed directly at the ramp openings. The first soldiers down were killed before touching the water. Those jumping from the sides of the craft fell into depths that made their 30-kilogram loads deadly traps. Several soldiers who could not swim drowned before a single bullet hit them. 27 of the 32 DD tanks, amphibious tanks launched from 4 kilometers offshore, sank in the waves before reaching land. The 2 that reached the beach were disabled in the surf zone. The first wave landed without armored support, with defenses untouched by a bombardment and under crossfire that left no blind spots. Lieutenant Fröking from the communications bunker of WN-62 transmitted artillery coordinates on the approaching landing craft. The Houtville battery responded with its 105mm howitzers. Franz Gockel, in his adjacent position, fired the machine gun and watched in disbelief. Despite casualties, despite the fire, the landing craft kept coming, one after another. The tide constantly brought more soldiers. "We could not understand why those under the hail of bullets kept coming back," he would write years later in his memoirs. On the German front, that question, "Why don't they stop?" was the earliest sign that something fundamental had changed. At 10:12 a.m., the day's most significant radiogram arrived from WN-62. Only one machine gun remained operational in that resistance nest. It was Heinrich Severlow's, and Severlow was not going to stop. The MG-42 and the man who didn't stop shooting the WN-62 was built on an uneven slope of short grass and sandstone that descended toward the edge of the cliffs. The men in position could see the entire beach with ruthless clarity. The wet, brown sand, the steel obstacles scattered in the tidal zone, the white breakers and beyond, boats approaching in line. Heinrich Severlow, 21 years old, born in Metzingen, the present-day Eldingen in Lower Saxony, was not a fanatic. According to his later account, he did not want to be in that war, he did not want to be in France, and he did not want to fire a machine gun at boys his own age. He had been assigned to Lieutenant Fröking as an orderly, a role of personal assistant and messenger. But at WN-62 that day, Fröking was coordinating artillery fire from the communications bunker, and Severlow was the only one left in position with the machine gun. When the front ramps of the first landing craft fell in front of Easy Red Beach, the machine gun began to operate. The instructions were clear. Wait until the soldiers had water up to their knees to ensure that they were on the beach and could not retreat. Franz Gockel, observing from his adjacent position, described it like this. "Soon the entire beach was filled with Americans. Many remained lying on the sand, but when the water arrived, they also had to keep moving. We took them under fire again. We could not understand why those under the hail of bullets kept coming back despite their huge losses." Severlow fired without interruption for hours. Only at moments when the MG-42 barrels overheated and needed to cool did he use a Carabiner 98K rifle to continue maintaining fire. One of the rifles became so hot that its mechanism was damaged and had to be replaced. Soldiers supplying him with ammunition from a nearby bunker kept the supply chain running. The second machine gun of WN-62 was rendered inoperable mid-morning by grenade fragments. Sevelo was the only operator functioning in his sector. Around 10:12 a.m., a radio message transmitted from the German positions confirmed what Sevelo had already suspected when he heard the silence around him. Only one machine gun remained active at WN-62. It was his. The most disturbing moment of that morning, according to his memoirs published in 2000 under the title WN-62, Erinnerungen an Omaha Beach, was not firing without rest for hours. It was a single shot. In front of his position, behind the remains of 2 concrete blocks from an old construction material mill, an American soldier carrying a flamethrower on his back took cover. Sevelo saw him, aimed with the K-98 and fired. The bullet pierced the soldier's helmet. That single shot among the thousands he fired that day was etched in his memory in a way the others were not. For years it visited him in dreams, worse than having seen dozens of men fall to MG-42 bursts. That man had a face. Around 2 p.m., Sevelo spotted Sherman tanks approaching from the west. The MG-42's main ammunition was almost depleted, and he continued firing with tracer rounds. Soon after, an explosion hit his position and wounded his face. He stayed at his post. At 3 p.m., Lieutenant Fröking, aware that the flanks had fallen, and WN-62 was practically surrounded, ordered a retreat. There were 3 men left, Fröking, Sevelo, and a soldier whose name was not recorded. According to Sevelo, Fröking looked at him before ordering him to leave first. He shook his hand, looked at him seriously, and told him to be very careful. Sevelo obeyed. He ran from crater to crater toward Saint-Laurent. He waited for the lieutenant. The lieutenant did not arrive. A shot to the head in the open field. Fröking died during the retreat. The unnamed soldier fell later, inland. Sevelo fired for 9 hours a minimum of 12,000 rounds with the MG-42 and about 400 with the K-98. Estimates of the casualties he inflicted, even the most conservative among historians, exceed 1,000. He himself, in a 2004 interview, stated, "It was definitely at least 1,000 men, very likely over 2,000. But I don't know how many men I shot. It was horrible. Thinking about it makes me want to vomit." The sleeping command. The German reaction. While the men in the resistance nests fought alone and without reinforcements, the German chain of command was going through one of the war's most severe crises. It was not just that Hitler slept until 9 in the morning. The problem was that the entire system was designed to paralyze itself. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was not at his command post in La Roche-Guyon Castle. He had traveled to Herlingen, Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday on June 5th, and he planned to visit Hitler the next day to try to gain operational control over the 12th SS Panzer and the Panzer Lehr units. When he was informed by telephone at 6:30 a.m. on June 6th that the landing had begun, he started an immediate return, but by the time he reached his headquarters, the critical window of the first hours had already closed. General Friedrich Dollmann, commander of the 7th Army, had called a war exercise in Rennes for June 6th, a simulated response to an Allied invasion, which meant that much of his divisional command was either on the road to Rennes or already in the city when the landing began. General Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben of the 709th Division and General Wilhelm Falley of the 91st Airborne Division were among them. Both turned back upon receiving reports. Falley did not make it. Returning to his headquarters near Corentin, he was ambushed on the road by American paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division. He was thrown from the vehicle with serious injuries. When he tried to reach for his pistol while crawling, an American lieutenant finished him off. General Falley was the first German general to die in Normandy. General Edgar Feuchtinger, commander of the 21st Panzer Division, the only armoured unit deployed at a reasonable distance from the coast, was not at his command post that night. He was with his mistress in Paris and did not have a radio with him. His absence contributed to the confusion already caused by the complexity of the chain of command. The division was practically paralyzed for hours, engaged in small skirmishes against the British paratroopers of the 6th Airborne Division, who had landed east of the Orne River. but without receiving clear orders to attack the beaches. Hitler woke around 8 a.m. When he was informed of the landings, he appeared satisfied. Convinced that this was a diversion and that the real strike would come at the Pas de Calais, he declared that the time had come to destroy the Allies on the continent. He took the situation calmly. It would not be until early afternoon that he authorized the movement of the Panzer Reserve divisions. At 10:30 a.m., General Erich Marx, commander of the 84th Corps and the highest-ranking officer placed at the center of the crisis by the events, ordered the 21st Panzer Division to attack British positions on the beaches. The division's immediate superior, Führer himself, now back at his post, cancelled the order on the grounds that it required authorization from Army Group B. A chain of calls ensued among Fritz Bayerlein, Dollmann and Marx over whether to move the tanks in broad daylight or not. Bayerlein considered it madness to expose armoured units to naval artillery and Allied fighter bombers for what he still believed was a secondary incursion. At 2:30 p.m., Gerd von Rundstedt finally ordered Commander Fritz Witt to have the 12th SS Panzer Hitlerjugend advance toward the Normandy coast. He did so reluctantly. He feared that moving this unit north would leave it poorly positioned to respond to what he still considered the real invasion at Calais. At 4 p.m., the 21st Panzer Division was ordered to attack the gap between the British and Canadian landing zones. General Marx told Colonel Hermann von Oppeln-Bronichowski, who would lead the attack, "If we do not drive the British into the sea, we will have lost the war." 80 Panzer IV tanks advanced north between the Norman hedgerows, accompanied by mechanized infantry of the 192nd Panzer Grenadier Regiment under Colonel Rauch. For a few hours, part of the force reached the coast at Luc-sur-Mer and Lyon-sur-Mer, momentarily separating the Juno and Sword beachheads. But the main panzer attack was stopped by the light infantry from Shropshire on the Perrier Ridge. The tanks opened fire from the base of the hill and faced 6-pound anti-tank guns, Firefly tanks with their devastating 17-pound cannons, and self-propelled artillery. Within 10 minutes, 6 Mark IVs were burning on the right flank and 9 more on the left flank near Mathieu. The survivors sought cover in ditches and groves. At 9 p.m., a large formation of Allied gliders crossed the sky transporting reinforcements to the Orne airborne bridgehead. Führer interpreted the movement as a landing in the rear of his division and ordered Rauch to withdraw from the coast. The remnants of the 21st Panzer returned toward Caen. In the process, they abandoned the survivors of the 716th Static Division, who were still holding out in their coastal bunkers. The first serious set of coordinated offensive orders issued by the German command was not given until 12:07 a.m. on June 7, 1944, 14 hours after the start of the landing. Hitler's children, the 12th SS in combat. On June 7, 1944, when the first elements of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend arrived at the Normandy front, no one on the Allied side knew exactly what was approaching. The division was composed mostly of young men aged 17 to 18, recruited from the ranks of the Hitler Youth. Its senior commanders came from the 1st SS Panzer Leibstandarte, veterans from the Eastern Front with years of combat experience. The combination was deliberate, ideological fanaticism built from childhood, combined with a command structure shaped on the extermination camps of the Soviet front. Their training had followed the motto imposed directly from Berlin: flexible as leather, tough as Krupp steel, fast as greyhounds. No exercises in barracks. All instruction was conducted under real combat conditions. They were instilled with unconditional loyalty to the mission, contempt for pain, and the willingness to sacrifice as the highest virtue. For many of those boys who arrived in Normandy in June 1944, war was the only way of life they had ever known intensely. Their commander was Standartenführer Fritz Witt, 35 years old, decorated with the Knight's Cross with oak leaves. He was accompanied by Kurt Meyer, a 33-year-old officer nicknamed Panzer Meyer for his tactical aggressiveness, who commanded the reconnaissance regiment. Meyer was known within the division for his ability to drag his men into combat through the strength of his personality, and among his soldiers circulated the belief that he was invulnerable. On June 7th, British forces attempted for the first time to advance toward Caen from the beachheads. They were stopped. On June 8th, they tried again. Stopped. On June 11th, the 51st Scottish Highland Infantry Division attacked south of Rambeil with the objective of reaching Seaton Norrin. After 2 days of fighting in the hedgerows, the Scots were forced to withdraw with heavy losses. Allied fighter bombers, British Typhoons and American P-47s, which the Germans called Jabos, relentlessly pursued any movement on the roads. The Hitler-Jugend soldiers nicknamed them the Raging Insects. From the air, Allied pilots called them the Children's Division and bet on whether the youthful fanaticism would withstand constant aerial harassment. It did, and more. The Hitler-Jugend fought in the Norman bocages, that labyrinthine network of narrow fields separated by vegetated walls up to 2 meters high, with a ferocity that surprised even the veterans. From positions camouflaged among the hedgerows, they deployed Panzerfausts, MG-42 machine guns, and anti-tank artillery in ambushes that turned every Allied advance attempt into a deadly trap. Many of their officers were impressed by the men they commanded. They withstood fire as if they had been in combat for years. On June 14, 1944, a British naval attack struck near the division's command post in Venizelle. Fritz Witt was hit in the face by shrapnel and died instantly along with one of his officers. The news caused a deep shock within the unit. Witt was buried with military honours in the Champigny-sur-Marne cemetery. Command passed to Kurt Meyer, who at 33 became the youngest general in the German army. By the end of the Normandy campaign, the Hitler-Jugend had suffered approximately 60% casualties. The Allies considered it the most feared force they faced in France. The Steel Storm, Operation Epsom. At the end of June 1944, the Allies' original plan was in serious trouble. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had anticipated capturing Caen on June 6 itself, during the first hours of the landing. 20 days after that date, the city was still in German hands, and the British had advanced only 10 kilometers from the beaches. The political pressure on Montgomery was intense, made worse by the contrast with Bradley's US First Army, which was advancing more smoothly across the Cotentin Peninsula toward Cherbourg. Montgomery devised Operation Epsom on June 21, 1944, an encircling maneuver west of Caen involving over 60,000 troops and approximately 600 tanks. The main force was the newly arrived British 8th Corps, which had landed on Gold and Juno beaches in the preceding days and had yet to see combat. The plan was simple in its geometry: cross the Odon River southwest of Caen, capture Hill 112, an elevation commanding access to the city from the south, and complete the envelopment from the west while the 30th Corps applied pressure from the left flank. If the maneuver succeeded, the German armoured divisions concentrated north and northeast of Caen would be trapped in a pocket. What Montgomery did not know was that while his forces were finalizing preparations, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps was arriving at the front from northern France and Belgium with the opposite mission: to launch a decisive counterattack that would push the Allies back into the sea. Their 4 divisions represented the most powerful concentration of armoured forces the Waffen-SS had assembled in a single theatre since the Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943. The 1st SS Panzer Leibstandarte positioned itself in the Bersan region. The 10th SS Panzer Frundsberg took up positions defending strategic Hill 112. The 9th SS Panzer Hohenstaufen deployed along the southern bank of the Odon, and the 2nd SS Panzer Das Reich settled in Neuers. In addition, there were nearly 80 88mm anti-aircraft guns from the Luftwaffe's 16th Division on land, converted for anti-tank combat. The 88mm gun was the most feared weapon by Allied armour. It could penetrate a Sherman's frontal armour at 2,000 meters, a range at which the Sherman could not respond effectively. Before the formal start of the offensive on June 24th to 25th, the British Second Army launched preliminary attacks that achieved partial advances. The British 33rd Corps, located on the left flank of the front, captured the towns of Tilly-sur-Seulles, Fontenay-le-Pesnel and Roré. In the centre, the 8th Corps took the villages of Le Mesnil-Patry and Noret-en-Bessin. The Canadian 2nd Corps, on the right sector, succeeded in occupying Rots. These advances, modest but real, created the starting position from which Epsom would be launched. At 7 a.m. on June 26, 1944, the offensive began with a massive artillery preparation. Over 700 guns opened fire simultaneously, supported by 500 RAF sorties and the fire of 3 British cruisers in the English Channel, plus the monitor HMS Roberts, whose 381mm main gun could deliver shells weighing over 800 kilograms up to 20 kilometers inland. Half an hour later, at 7:30, the 15th Scottish Infantry Division began its advance, penetrating nearly 4 kilometers into German lines and capturing La Gaule and Saint-Monvieux. In Saint-Monvieux, a crocodile flamethrower tank, a variant of the Churchill with a flamethrower instead of the main gun, was destroyed by the young soldier Émile Dürr. Severely wounded by enemy fire while approaching, Dürr fired 2 consecutive Panzerfausts and placed a magnetic mine on the armoured vehicle, turning it into a heap of iron. He was posthumously awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross. The Scots also entered Chur, but the advance stalled there due to unexpectedly fierce resistance. From perfectly camouflaged positions in the bocage, the network of hedgerows, vegetation walls and terraces that turned the Norman landscape into a maze of isolated compartments. German defenders from the Hitler Youth and Panzer elements emerged from cover that previous bombardments had not revealed. In Chur alone, the 15th Division lost 200 men in a few hours. 88mm guns positioned behind ridges destroyed Sherman tanks at distances at which the Sherman could not respond. Allied armor burned one after another without even seeing the tube of the weapon that hit them. By evening, a new attempt to cross the Odin River was repelled, leaving more dead among the Scots. On June 27th, the second day of the offensive, the British 11th Armoured Division, supported by the 43rd Wessex Infantry Division, attempted to cross the Odin at multiple points, but encountered Waffen-SS defences that closed each gap with immediate counterattacks. Nonetheless, the 15th Scottish Division fully captured Chur that day, and one of its units seized the Tourmauville Bridge over the Odon, establishing a precarious bridgehead on the southern bank. This was the deepest advance achieved since the landing in the eastern sector. The position expanded a few hours later with the capture of Grainville-sur-Odon. In the western sector, the 33rd Corps combined its progress with that of the 8th Corps to create a bulge about 8 kilometers deep and 4 kilometers wide west of Caen, exactly the wedge that the original plan envisioned. But the bulge was narrow, exposed on both flanks, and its supply lines crossed terrain that the Germans could fire upon from surrounding heights. On June 28th, the 11th Armoured Division made the riskiest advance. With the Odin bridgehead consolidated at Gavras and Barron, tanks attempted to climb Hill 112. It was only 112 meters above sea level, but it visually dominated all surrounding terrain within a 15-kilometer radius. Whoever controlled this hill controlled the southern approaches to Caen, the roads to Falaise, and the fuel depots that German divisions needed for any movement. The Germans knew this. The 10th SS Panzer Frundsberg had turned it into a fortress, 75mm and 88mm anti-tank guns in perfectly concealed positions, infantry teams equipped with Panzerfausts on the slopes, and forward observers coordinating heavy mortar fire from the woods at the hill's base. When the Sherman tanks of the 11th Division attempted to climb the slopes of Hill 112, they were destroyed with a systematicity that impressed even the defenders. Anti-tank guns fired from positions the tanks could not locate. 150mm shells fell on vehicles that paused to seek cover. In the early hours of the assault, the 11th Armoured Division lost dozens of tanks. Crew members who managed to escape the burning vehicles found themselves in open ground with no cover under machine gun fire from the woods. The assault on Hill 112 cost the British more armoured vehicles in a single day than they had lost in any other engagement since the landing. The hill would remain the object of fighting for weeks, changing hands several times, becoming one of the most bitter symbols of the Normandy campaign for the British Army. On June 29, 1944, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps launched its coordinated counterattacks, which had been the original objective of these divisions before the Allied advance forced them into defensive action. At 1800, the 9th SS Hohenstaufen attacked from Chur toward the north, trying to cut off the base of the Allied bulge, but was contained by the 49th West Riding Infantry Division in combat that lasted all night. The 2nd SS Das Reich attacked simultaneously north of the Odin and was stopped by the 15th Scottish Division. The 10th SS Frundsberg achieved the only German advances of the day. Small gains against the 11th Armoured Division that cost several Shermans but failed to cut the bulge. That same day, a German mortar shell killed Brigadier General Robert Hinder, commander of the British 7th Armoured Brigade, while observing the front from an advanced position. On June 30th, the German counterattacks began to lose momentum in the face of the Allied response. RAF Typhoon fighter bombers attacked German armoured concentrations in the rear in successive waves, using RP-3 rockets against columns of vehicles attempting to advance on the roads. The SS divisions lost around 40 tanks in that single day of air raids, without being able to bring them to the front. The paralysis the Germans had inflicted on the Allies since June 1st now turned against them. The same sky that had prevented the Panzers from moving to the beaches on D-Day continued to prevent them from advancing on the Allied Bulge 6 weeks later. At the beginning of July, Montgomery ordered Operation Epsom to be halted and units reorganized for the next phase. The outcome was devastating in terms of original expectations. The captured Bulge, 8 by 4 kilometers, was only a fraction of the territory the plan had envisioned. Caen was still in German hands, and Hill 112 had proven nearly impregnable. Allied casualties numbered around 4,000 men during the main days of the operation, with significant armoured losses, particularly in the fighting around Hill 112. The operation had achieved none of its declared strategic objectives. However, from the German perspective, Epsom was a tactical victory that contained within it the seeds of strategic defeat. To contain the Allied advance, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, which had arrived at the front intending to launch a decisive counterattack to drive the invaders into the sea, had to be consumed in defense. These 6 armored divisions, the only force capable of changing the balance of the campaign, were pinned in the Caen sector, bleeding men and material that could not be replaced. Each tank destroyed in the Norman hedgerows was irreplaceable. Each Sherman destroyed was replaced the next day by another descending from the landing ramps. The arithmetic of attrition warfare worked inexorably against the German side. Within the Axis High Command, fractures became public. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt and Field Marshal Erwin Rommel jointly proposed abandoning Caen, withdrawing to a stronger defensive line to the south and reorganizing the armored divisions for a counterattack with realistic chances. Hitler rejected the proposal without discussion. 2 days later, von Rundstedt was removed from command and replaced by Field Marshal Günther von Kluge. Geyer von Schweppenberg, head of Panzer Group West, was dismissed in favor of General Heinrich Eberbach. Friedrich Dollmann, commander of the 7th Army, committed suicide on June 28 after receiving notice he would be relieved of command and subjected to a court-martial for the loss of Cherbourg. Von Kluge arrived at the front, convinced that his predecessors had mismanaged a manageable situation. It took him less than 2 weeks to reach exactly the same conclusions: that the front could not be held with available resources, that Allied air superiority made any daytime concentration of forces impossible, and that Hitler would not authorize the only maneuver that could have prolonged the campaign. In an operational diary entry, von Kluge murmured to one of his aides after a meeting with corps commanders, "How can one fight when one is not even allowed to decide where to put a tank?" The city of Caen finally fell on July 20, 1944, 36 days behind Montgomery's original schedule. By then, most of the historic city had been reduced to rubble by Allied bombing. The Romanesque Saint-Étienne Cathedral, built by William the Conqueror in the 11th century, miraculously survived intact amid the ruins. Of the 60,000 civilians living in Caen before the war, over 20,000 had died or fled during the fighting. The German defenders who held out week after week in that perimeter paid the price for a strategy that condemned them to be consumed in positions they could not win, protecting a city Hitler refused to abandon and which the Allies had the means to destroy stone by stone. Time is running out. The tanks that could not advance. The fundamental problem of the Panzers in Normandy was not the quality of the armor or the courage of the crews, it was the sky. From the first day, Allied fighter bombers had established air dominance that turned any daytime tank movement into a deadly gamble. British Typhoons with their RP-3 rockets and American P-47 Thunderbolts patrolled the roads of Normandy like predators, detecting the reflection of the sun on a turret or the dust trail of a moving column. German tank crews had dubbed it the terror of the air, discussing it with a mixture of respect and despair. The Panzer, considered the most powerful armored division of the Reich on French soil, had 230 combat tanks and 600 motorized vehicles when it went into action. It tried to advance toward the front in the days following the landing. Its commander, Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, a veteran of North Africa and one of Rommel's trusted officers, later described what became a constant. Every time we moved out, the sky filled with fire. We would stop the engine and wait. Then we tried again. The roads were littered with craters caused by Allied rockets. In several points near Caen, entire columns of Panthers were burned out on the asphalt without having come into contact with the enemy. Logistics became a nightmare. Fuel depots, bridges over the Orne River, and railways connecting Normandy with the rest of France had been systematically destroyed by pre-landing bombings as part of the so-called Allied transportation campaign. Trucks moved at night, covered with branches to reduce reflections, and yet still suffered losses. Messengers trying to re-establish communication between units disappeared on crater-filled roads. Tanks that ran out of fuel remained immobile at crossroads, abandoned by their crews or waiting for supplies that never arrived. General Geyer von Schweppenberg tried to coordinate his divisions from the Panzer Group West headquarters under increasing difficulty. His concept of tactical maneuver, the so-called Auftragstaktik, based on local initiative and the flexibility of intermediate commanders, clashed with the rigidity imposed from Berlin. The battlefield changes every minute, and we are still waiting for authorizations that arrive half a day late, he remarked to his staff. On June 18th, an Allied air raid directly destroyed the Panzer Group West headquarters, seriously wounding Schweppenberg and eliminating a large part of his staff. From that moment on, the coordination of counterattacks became irreversibly fragmented. Rommel, who understood the scale of the disaster, traveled to Margeval on June 17th to report personally to Hitler. The meeting was tense. Rommel spoke bluntly. The situation in Normandy required a political decision. Militarily, the front could not be sustained without a retreat. Hitler listened in silence and responded coldly that the enemy would be repelled and that there would be no withdrawal. Rommel left the room knowing that the war in the West was lost. He did not say it aloud. He could not say it. In the Norman forests, tanks and men waited. Engines started at night, moved a few kilometers through dark hedgerows, and stopped before dawn. In the days following Operation Epsom, a liaison officer of the 7th SS Götz von Berlichingen later recalled that operational reports still listed battalion positions that had not existed for days. "We kept transmitting coordinates of units that were dead or missing," he said. The encirclement and the end. From Caen to Falaise. The city of Caen finally fell on July 20th, 1944, 36 days behind Montgomery's schedule. But even this fall was the prelude to a greater disaster. For weeks, the Allies had been attempting to surround Caen from the east and west with successive operations. Operation Charnwood on July 8th included a carpet aerial bombardment followed by a massive infantry assault. The 12th SS Hitler Jugend, which remained the central bulwark of the defense, was reduced to several hundred infantrymen and 40 tanks. The Luftwaffe's 16th Field Division was practically annihilated, yet the defenders resisted with such stubbornness that it took the Allies another 12 days to capture the city completely. During this entire period, fighting took place south of Caen around Villers-Bocage. On June 13th, Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann, commander of a Tiger I company of the 101st Heavy SS Tank Battalion, carried out one of the most spectacular episodes of armored warfare. Advancing almost alone in his Tiger, he destroyed within minutes 11 British tanks and 13 additional armored vehicles belonging to the 7th Armored Division and the 1st Battalion of the Rifle Brigade Regiment. The British column was destroyed, and the Allied advance in that sector was temporarily halted. But the Allied reaction was swift. The next day, the Panzer Lehr and the 2nd Panzer combined forces to force a general British withdrawal in the sector. This was the last German opportunity to flank the beachhead. On July 25, 1944, Operation Cobra began, the decisive attack of the U.S. First Army under General Omar Bradley in the western sector. It was preceded by one of the largest concentrated aerial bombardments of the war. Thousands of tons of bombs fell on German positions south of Saint-Lô. The Panzer Lehr, which had been repositioned to this sector, was practically destroyed. Its commander Bayerlein later described the scene. Roads turned into crater-filled channels, tanks overturned by the force of the explosions, men in shock wandering aimlessly among the rubble. The breakthrough at Cobra opened the door for General George Patton's Third Army, which advanced toward Brittany, the Loire, and the east at a speed that the Wehrmacht's tanks could not match. The German divisions, exhausted and fuel-deprived, tried to retreat while the Allies closed in on their flanks. Hitler ordered a counterattack. On August 7, 1944, 5 Panzer divisions gathered around the town of Mortain attempted to cut the gap opened by Patton as he advanced toward Avranches. Altogether, they had approximately 220 tanks and 70 assault guns. Allied artillery, fighter bombers, and anti-tank units halted their advance within less than 5 miles. At least 100 tanks were destroyed in 3 days. The Mortain counterattack was the last major German offensive effort in Normandy. It was a complete failure. By mid-August, the Canadian First Army was attacking south from Caen, while the Americans pressed from the south. The two pincers closed on the remnants of the German 7th Army and the 5th Panzer Army in the Falaise pocket. On August 19th, the Allies closed the encirclement at Chambois. Around 20,000 German soldiers managed to escape but were forced to leave virtually all their equipment behind, thousands of vehicles, hundreds of guns, the last operational tanks. The German 7th Army had ceased to exist as a fighting force. The final figures for the German side in the Battle of Normandy: 290,000 casualties, including killed, wounded, and captured. 2,000 tanks committed in the battle, of which the Panzer divisions escaped with barely 70 between them. Of the 38 German divisions that fought in Normandy, 25 were completely destroyed. The remainder were reduced to fragmented units without cohesion.